The year 554 AC has long since believed to have been one of the many records lost in the Great Fire of the Citadel. Until one day, merchants from Bravos appeared at the steps of the Citadel with chests of documents. At the beginning of 554, there were a number of allegiances throughout Westeros. As they listed: Dragon, 7 Legends, Rising, Misfit, Rebel, Savage, Mist, Hell, Rage, Dawn, Booty, Legacy, and Robin Hood. Within our text are also records of non-maesters. After careful examination of the documents, the goat, and the serpent, the maesters will not fully indulge them in this singular text, but they will use excerpts from their writings to help reference to the history we find throughout. At the beginning of the year 554 AC, there were 3 main sets of allies: 7 Legends and Rising, Misfit, Rebel, and Savage, known as the Thruple, and Dragon and Mist, known as the Coalition. Legacy, a longtime ally of 7 Legends, after breaking their ally status just before the turn of the year, they make it evident that they are going to work with Dragon, thus making them a part of the Coalition. Our records show that early on, 7 Legends, Rising, Misfit, Savage, and Rebel talk the future for the kingdom and agree that they all have one common enemy: the Coalition. During these talks, Brandon, being cautious of his new friends, explains the intentions of his allegiance and how they will take the most strategic areas in Westeros to combat the Coalition. Not that he and his allegiance wanted to own the realm, but to ensure that the strongholds of the kingdom wouldn't fall into hands of a false friendship. Some at the table of talks were hesitant of this. That night, when they were all to meet again, Maverick, other known as Grizz, the leader of the allegiance, Savage, was nowhere to be found, leaving only a note stating he had other matters to attend to. Now, this is a point where our found records are divided into what the reason was that Maverick left that night. One record tells us that he went back to convene with his council on the matter of the talks and decided that Savage would be working alone in the matter of the kingdom. Another record tells us that he flew his dragon to the stronghold of the Coalition to announce his loyalties. Whichever of these records hold true, or whether they both hold some sort of truth, history does not say. What our records do tell us that the Savage allies, Rebel and Misfit, were struck with the confusion of their abrupt exit from their ally. Not long after, a raven was received stating that Savage was no longer participating in the talks and they would battle for control of the regions against Seven Legends and Rising, if it came down to it. Seven Legends had taken control of the Westerland's paramount, Casterly Rock, defenses at the ready, with their eyes scanning for the first sight of the Coalition troops. The troops were seen at last, marching towards Casterly Rock and ready for the attack. This was all to be expected, but what Seven Legends didn't expect to see was the Savage banner flying alongside the banner of Dragon. This battle went on for what seemed like days, and ending with a victory for the Coalition. After the Great Battle of Casterly, the leaders of Seven Legends were infuriated. They felt as though they had been slighted. And now it was evident that Savage from the Thruple were now allied with Dragon and had joined the Coalition. The eyes of the kingdom turned towards Misfit and Rebel. A decision had to be made: denounce their alliance with Savage, or remain by their side. Whilst Rebel and Misfit were shut behind their council doors deliberating, another allegiance had taken a great blow. When Dragon chose to bring Savage into the Coalition, the allegiance Mist broke their alliance with the Dragon, thus exiting themselves from the Coalition. Our records show that to keep pace with the kingdom and their people, Mist made it known that they would stay on the side of neutrality whilst the war for the kingdom bled on. The council doors opened and Misfit and Rebel emerged. After much deliberation, the two decided that they wished to keep their thruple together, which in turn resulted in Misfit and Rebel becoming the fourth and the fifth new installation into the Coalition. Many maesters record that the decision to join the Coalition was solely to keep the thruple together, not because they wished to be allied with their old enemy. While many of the banners were dissatisfied with the decision, out of loyalty, they stayed by their liege's side. Over the following weeks, the Coalition grew in numbers. Allegiances all across Westeros were raising their banners to join the force. If our records are to be believed, some of the allegiance to join the Coalition did it out of strategy. Some joined to keep themselves from the wrong end of the Coalition's sword, while others joined purely out of the want to see their old opposition, Seven Legends, fall. Luckily, our maesters took time to record the allegiances and where they stood in the war. The Coalition: Dragon, Legacy, Savage, Misfit, Rebel, Booty, Hell, and Robin Hood. Seven Legends and Rising. The neutral allegiances in the kingdom, Rage, and Mist. Over the course of their history, Seven Legends have been on both sides of the war, both defending and attacking. Prior to the new era, they spent many of their days defending their paramounts and seats of power against an allegiance known by the name of Elysium. To understand more of the layout of Westeros during this time, we must step back and look into other texts that were found years after the burning of the Citadel. We do have much history of the allegiance Elysium and the Great War against Seven Legends, but our records do not show exactly what happened to the allegiance itself. Our full accounts end with their change of tides and the full assault on Seven Legends. After that, there are few records that are tangible. Our records do show that after the disappearance of Elysium's leader, Cheese, all of his lands and the entirety of his army were sold to a merchant in Braavos. The name Elysium then disappears from the books, and several house names begin to merge. One notable name being that of an old house, the name Riot. The Allegiance Riot held a number of the names that were in Elysium, whilst other banners of Elysium joined other houses. Soon thereafter, Riot and Rising had approached each other about combining their forces into one. Rising's T1 Doe, who had remained neutral in the war between Elysium and Seven Legends, looked to sit down with the Council of Seven Legends to ensure that no ill will would fall between them if Rising and Riot were to join together. To the relief of Doe and his council, Seven Legends stated that their war was with Elysium, and that seeing as Elysium was no more, that no ill will would be found in the matter. And so Rising and Riot were made one. And as quick as day becomes night, Seven Legends and Rising, hearing of the new power that had risen in Westeros, struck an alliance together. And that brings us back to our main story. With the Coalition outnumbering the allies of Seven Legends and Rising, they were able to cover more ground and bring more battles on more fronts. But where the allies fought, they showed the Coalition their strength. The battles went on for months as the Coalition held most of the kingdom, as well as King's Landing, whilst the allies held strong where they were, controlling 2 to 3 paramounts at a time, making it known that they would not be taken down lightly. After studying the war strategies of the Coalition, the allies of Seven Legends and Rising were able to put an end to the quote-unquote bombing out by the Coalition forces. At this time in the records, it shows that Winterfell, the Eyrie, Dragonstone, Casterly Rock, Storm's End, Highgarden, and King's Landing were held by the Coalition, while River Run and Sunspear were held by the Allies. A change of heart. Weeks of being attacked by the Coalition, Mist felt as they were being targeted as though they were the enemy of their old ally, whilst the Allies Seven Legends Rising took notice of Mist's neutrality on the battlefield and kept their attacks solely for their enemy. After the attacks continued for quite some time, the Council of Mist decided that it was time to break their neutrality in the kingdom. They had picked a side, and that was the side of Rising and Seven Legends, thus resulting in the start of a movement against the Coalition. With Seven Legends, Rising, and Mist joining forces, they now had more troops to cover more ground across Westeros. The Maesters recorded this mass movement against the Coalition as the turn of the tide. Small folk and Maesters alike began to call this alliance the Revolution. Once Seven Legends, Mist, and Rising joined their forces against the Coalition, the map of Westeros slowly began to turn favor. Now, this wasn't an easy task, as nothing was handed over. The Revolution had to take what they wanted by force. Nuke-style attacks are what some of the Maesters call it, and this style of attacking was observed and put into most of the attacks done by both the Revolution and the Coalition. After weeks of marching their soldiers and flying their dragons through every inch of Westeros, the Revolution had flown their banners of victory on every paramount from the north to the sands of Dorne in the south, excluding Dragonstone, a Maester includes into the notes. While Seven Legends did hold Dragonstone for a time, this was before the incarnation of the Revolution. At this time, in the records, the Maesters tell us that Winterfell, the Eyrie, River Run, Highgarden, and Storm's End were held by the Revolution, while Sunspear, Dragonstone, Casterly Rock, and King's Landing were held by the Coalition. It was at this time that the Revolution decided to officially combine their forces into one allegiance. The councils convened, and the Revolution joined their armies under the Seven Legends banner. Almost immediately, the Revolution marched on the Coalition defenses. After joining together under one banner, the revolution's first paramount to seize was Casterly Rock. While we have no in-depth records of the battle at Casterly Rock that day, rumors from foot soldiers and townspeople alike tell us that even though previous history of battles at Casterly were some of the most fierce and bloodiest and lasted days and months, this particular battle was the quickest and least bloody of the fights they'd ever seen. Some sailors even japed that only one single solitary squire died that day at Casterly. After Casterly, the revolution set their marches east towards Dragonstone. Whilst their marches were headed to their target, word was received that Storm's End was under siege by the Coalition. So, the revolution sent aid to defend Storm's End while still continuing their march to Dragonstone. The two battles raged on throughout the weekend. At one point, the Coalition seemed to have won Storm's End, but before the sun had set that evening, both Storm's End and Dragonstone had the rose banners flying from their castles. It was at this point that the revolution drew up their plans for their assault on the throne. The Coalition forces quietly marched through the north and set up their formations outside of Winterfell. The second and third parties of the Coalition marched on River Run and the Eyrie. After counting the numbers of troops seen marching across Westeros, many officers from different allegiances reported back to their lieges that King's Landing had been left completely defenseless and there was no sign of the Coalition within its walls. With KL left defenseless, an allegiance by the name of Falked set their attacks and claimed the throne. After Falked had taken control of King's Landing, the Maesters record what followed as a dance of thrones. As the revolution were marching to take back the Eyrie and River Run, large and small allegiances alike were looking for their claims in the kingdom, and so began a dance of thrones. Our records show that during this dance, several allegiances attempted to claim the Iron Throne. Some of the allegiances include Falked, Hell, Mafia, Meh, Ravens, Riot, and Ohana. While the dance continued, the revolution were able to siege back and reacquire the Eyrie and River Run. During the Dance of Thrones, the revolution sent a march of soldiers led by the lieges Doe and Harley to take King's Landing. Their attacks were successful, and while the battles were never ceasing across Westeros, Harley and Doe set their defenses in wait. The dust settled, and the tide had turned in the kingdom. The revolution had conquered King's Landing. The Coalition was not quietened, though. They made sure they held strongholds throughout the kingdom, and just as the realm was when King Aegon I had made his conquest, Dorne was all that was left. After the main troops of the revolution marched into King's Landing and flew the old Seven Legends banner of red and black, there was little time to rest as the revolution wanted to keep their momentum and march on the Sunspear. But before the marches even made it to Dorne, the revolution scouts had returned and stated that Sunspear was just as King's Landing had been, empty. And so the final region of Westeros was conquered by the revolution. But where had the Coalition gone? That was answered quickly, as ravens had made it to the revolution that several strongholds across Westeros were under siege, and so defenses were dispatched, and the war continued.